The city of Kabul has experienced so much upheaval for decades, and this is another change to get used to, and one that's far from easy.
The
situation for now is not clear. No one can say what will happen. All the people are just lost and confused.
In the space of one traumatic day, life on the streets feels completely different. This is one of the most obvious signs of the transformation that's taken place here literally overnight. The whole of the center of Kabul is protected by these fortified checkpoints, concrete blocks, barriers, normally guards carrying automatic weapons and armored Humvees with heavy machine guns. On this morning, nothing. People have been getting used to the novelty of a new force in charge, the subject of intense curiosity as Taliban take up checkpoint duties on the roads.
Whoever used to fear us, they've now seen the Mujahideen and that we are from the soil, and we don't want Afghanistan to be destroyed.
But there's widespread nervousness about what this new Taliban rule will look like. Many businesses and shops remain closed, though there are signs of life returning to normal.
If there's peace, then everyone will benefit, the businesses, the workers.
There are deep-rooted fears about the erosion of basic rights, in particular for women and girls, despite assurances from the Taliban, and about a return to cruel punishments for certain crimes. But many still remember life under the previous Taliban government being at least crime-free for the most part.
Everybody will be safe. Nobody's kid will be kidnapped again for ransom.
With the sudden collapse of the Afghan government, the people of Kabul and their new leaders have been thrown together faster than any had expected. Now, together, they're feeling their way forward into their new reality.
So, Rob, when you're out there on the streets of Kabul, it must feel almost quite surreal.
It is rather strange, especially this was the first day, if you like, of this new reality, the first full day of Taliban control. And you saw it on the faces of people coming out, Kabul residents, Monday morning, seeing these Taliban, some of them for the first time. Some of the older residents, of course, will remember their rule from previously, from the mid-90s through till 2000, 2001. Many people having, of course, very bad memories, very bad experiences of that time. The Taliban, of course, are insisting this is a different type of rule now. There will be a different type of Taliban, more sensitive, etc. But it remains to be seen, especially in Kabul, if they will meet those words with actions, if they'll live up to that. And of course, there is far more scrutiny now, 20 years later, because of communications and technology. The whole world is watching, and the whole world, of course, will remember what Afghanistan went through before 2001 and some of the horrors. So they are very much under scrutiny, and you do get a sense of that they do feel as though the world is watching.
And as to those scenes from the airport, Rob, is anyone actually in charge of the airport? Because it's a couple of hours since people were trying to get onto or literally hang on to those aircraft.
There is a certain amount of order, if you like, but there are two lines that are separated by this chaos in the middle. Let me explain. If you have outside the terminal now, you have a Taliban cordon, armed Taliban keeping people away from the terminal. There's still a big pressure. A lot of people would still like to get in there. In fact, we do hear occasionally the odd burst of gunfire. We know that Taliban soldiers and also US soldiers, it seems, have been using weapons mainly to scare away people, to force them back at gunpoint. You also have the US defensive line inside the terminal, inside the
Rob,
airport,
I'm going to pause you there, for which I apologise. We're going live to the United Nations in New York because this special meeting on Afghanistan has just kicked off. It was scheduled to take place in about 10 minutes from now. Delegates, members and ambassadors are in the chamber slightly early. Let's listen in to what's being said.
A generation of young Afghan women and girls, boys and men. At this grave hour, I urge all parties, especially the Taliban, to exercise utmost restraint to protect lives and to ensure that humanitarian needs can be met. conflict has forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. The capital city has seen a huge influx of internally displaced persons from provinces around the country where they felt insecure or fled during fighting. I remind all parties of their obligation to protect civilians. And I call on all parties to provide humanitarians with unimpeded access to deliver timely and life-saving services and aid. And I also urge all countries to be willing to receive Afghan refugees and refrain from any deportations. Mr. President, now is the time to stand as one. The international community must be united and utilize all available instruments to ensure the following. First, we must speak with one voice to uphold human rights in Afghanistan. I call upon the Taliban and all parties to respect and protect international humanitarian law and the rights and freedoms of all persons. We are receiving chilling reports of severe restrictions on human rights throughout the country. And I am particularly concerned by accounts of mounting human rights violations against the women and girls of Afghanistan who fear a return to the darkest days. It is essential that the hard-won rights of Afghan women and girls are protected. They are looking to the international community for support, the same international community that assured them that opportunities would be expanded, education would be guaranteed, freedoms would be spread, and rights would be secured. Second, the international community must unite to make sure that Afghanistan is never again used as a platform or safe haven for terrorist organizations. I appeal to the Security Council and the international community as a whole to stand together, to work together and act together, and use all tools at its disposal to suppress the global terrorist threat in Afghanistan and to guarantee that basic human rights will be respected. Regardless of who holds power, these two fundamental principles, in which our world has such a deep and abiding interest, must be upheld. Mr. President, the United Nations is committed to supporting Afghans. We continue to have staff and offices in areas that have come under Taliban control. I am relieved to report that, in large measure, our personnel and premises have been respected. We urge the Taliban to continue to do so and to honor the integrity and inviolability of diplomatic envoys and premises. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan affects 18 million people, fully half of the country's population. It is vital that basic services continue to be provided. In a statement issued yesterday, the Taliban said that they would work with the existing institutions. It is crucial that civil servant salaries continue to be paid, infrastructure is maintained, airports are reopened, and health and education services continue. The United Nations presence will adapt to the security situation. But above all, we will stay and deliver in support of the Afghan people in their hour of need. Looking ahead, I call for an immediate end to violence, for the rights of all Afghans to be respected, and for Afghanistan to comply with all international agreements to which it is a party. Mr. President, Afghans are a proud people with a rich cultural heritage. They have known generations of war and hardship. They deserve our full support. The following days will be pivotal. The world is watching. We cannot and must not abandon the people of Afghanistan. And I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to the representative of Afghanistan. You have the floor, please.
Your Excellency, the President, Excellency, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity to speak at yet another Council meeting on the situation in Afghanistan and for India's leadership of the Council during this critical period. We welcome the convening of this emergency session of the Security Council on the situation in Afghanistan and thank all the Council members, particularly Estonia and Norway, as co-pin holder of Afghanistan, for their role in organizing this session. Mr. President, today I'm speaking on behalf of millions of people in Afghanistan whose fate hangs in the balance and are faced with an extremely uncertain future. I'm speaking for millions of Afghan girls and women who are about to lose their freedom to go to school, to work, and to participate in the political, economic, and social life of the country. I'm speaking for thousands of human rights defenders, journalists, academics, civil servants, and former security personnel whose lives are at risk for defending human rights and democracy. I'm speaking for thousands of internally displaced people who are desperately in need of shelter, food, and protection in Kabul and other places. As you're witnessing yourself, the situation in Kabul, a city of about 6 million people, is extremely worrying, to say the least. You have seen chaotic scenes at the Kabul International Airport as desperate citizens are trying to leave the country. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned about Taliban's not honoring their promises and commitments made in their statements at Doha and at other international fora. We've witnessed time and again how Taliban have broken their promises and commitments in the past. We have seen gruesome images of Taliban's mass executions of military personnel and target killings of civilians in Kandahar and other big cities. Mr. President, we cannot allow this to happen in Kabul, which has been the last refuge for many people escaping violence and Taliban's revenge attacks. Kabul residents are reporting that Taliban have already started house-to-house searches in some neighborhoods, registering names and looking for people in their target list. There are already reports of target killings and looting in the city. Kabul residents are living in absolute fear right now. Mr. President, there is no time for blame game anymore. We have an opportunity to prevent further violence, prevent Afghanistan descending into a civil war and becoming a pariah state. Therefore, the Security Council and the UN Secretary General should use every means at its disposal to call for an immediate cessation of violence and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Call on the Taliban to fully respect the general amnesty offered by them, cease target killing and revenge attacks, and abide by international humanitarian laws. Urge that no public institutions and service delivery infrastructure be demolished, including works of arts in museums and media institutions. Stress that anyone violating human rights of Afghan citizens and international humanitarian law will be held accountable. Urgently establish a humanitarian corridor for the evacuation of those at risk of Taliban's retributions and attacks. Call on neighboring countries of Afghanistan to open their borders and facilitate exit of people trying to escape and entry of goods for humanitarian relief and operations. Call for the immediate establishment of an inclusive and representative transitional government that includes all ethnic groups and women representatives, which can lead to a dignified and lasting solution to the conflict, bring peace, and preserve the gains of the last 20 years, especially for women and girls. Stress that the Council and the United Nations will not recognize any administration that achieves power through force or any government that is not inclusive and representative of its diversity of the country. Unequivocally state that it does not recognize the restoration of the Islamic Emirate as reaffirmed in previous Council statement and agreements. Establish international guarantees for the implementation of a future political agreement. And finally, mobilize urgent humanitarian assistance for the 18 million people of Afghanistan, particularly those displaced by current conflict. The UN humanitarian appeal at $1.3 billion remain 40% funded. We urge the international community to meet the remainder of this life-saving appeal to provide critical aid to all internally displaced people. At the end, I would like to thank the United Nations and many other international organizations who are on the ground providing life-saving humanitarian support and monitoring human rights on the ground. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Afghanistan for his statement. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President.
You're watching Al Jazeera. We're live for you there at the UN building in New York. We heard there from Antonio Guterres. He was talking about respecting human rights. Now it's the time to stand as one. We must be united, he said, but significantly. We heard from Ghulam Azakzai, the Afghan ambassador to the UN. He said he was speaking on behalf of millions of people, speaking for women, girls, journalists, internally displaced people. He said, we've seen how the Taliban have broken their promises in the past. Sitting in on that discussion, watching it for us from his usual vantage point, is our diplomatic editor, James Bays. James, what do you make of what we've heard so far?
Well, I think what you heard from the Secretary-General was deep concern from the United Nations. Two main areas that they were looking at. One was human rights and one was the possibility of, as he describes it, terrorist organisations returning to Afghanistan. Those are clearly the major concerns of the UN, which keeps its operation, UNAMA, on the ground in Afghanistan. He says they are staying, but I can tell you the reality right now is they are staying but locked in their compounds because of the security situation and the worries about the security situation. We'll need to check in the coming hours whether they're going to start doing some of their humanitarian work again. I think also important is what we heard then from the Afghan ambassador to the United Nations. Yes, he is still the Afghan ambassador to the United Nations, even though he was sent to New York in that job by a government that no longer exists. And I think it's going to be interesting as we hear the other speakers to see whether some of the countries start to nod towards recognizing the Taliban. And certainly we're hearing that coming out of Moscow and Beijing. Not a formal recognition yet, but the idea that they'll be prepared to work with the Taliban. So listen very carefully in the next hour or so when we have the speeches from the Russian and the Chinese ambassador. I think it'll also be interesting to hear from some of the US's close allies in Afghanistan. Behind the scenes, I can tell you, they are not saying good things about what's happened. They don't feel they were properly consulted before President Biden made his announcement that he was withdrawing the troops, and they don't think that this has been handled in a good way by the US, the way that they've handled the withdrawal. Will we hear that publicly? Certainly. I heard the Irish ambassador on the way in use the word catastrophe. So it'd be interesting to see how some of those allies respond. 15 members of the Security Council, 6 of them at some point had troops, the US and 5 others, troops in Afghanistan over the last 20 years.
But James, when the Afghan ambassador Ghulam Azakzai was talking about establishing a humanitarian corridor and calling on Afghanistan's neighbouring countries to open their borders, the reality is that it's too early for that to happen yet, because we're still, this is just 24 hours in effect since Ashraf Ghani did a bunk, and that border between Afghanistan and Pakistan essentially is sealed. Afghanistan needs Pakistan, Pakistan needs Afghanistan, but Afghanistan's a landlocked country, and I guess diplomats must understand why Islamabad is choosing to essentially, as I say, keep that border closed. The Chinese as well, they have a very short border that they share with Afghanistan, but there are certain strategic issues that Beijing would be worried about when it comes to what happens with those border crossings.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of people crossing the border, I don't think, given where the border with China is, Afghanistan looks a little bit like this, like a fist. Well, the border with China is at the very top there. It's a tiny border and a pretty mountainous region. But I think the places that there are going to be major refugee flows are potentially into Pakistan and Iran. And both countries have housed millions of Afghan refugees in the past. And I don't think will want to publicly signal that they're opening the border borders and have a humanitarian corridor in the way the ambassador suggested, because that may lead to a major displacement of people across the borders. The UN is worried that literally millions of people might try to leave Afghanistan. Also worth noting that the Afghan ambassador was still talking about the idea of a representative transitional government representing all the different factions in Afghanistan. And remember, that's what they were talking about in those talks in Doha that never got to an agreement. Well, I don't think there's any sign that the Taliban now are going back to that plan. The Taliban have all of Afghanistan. They're in total control, and I don't think they're going to give that up.
And as far as Mr. Isaaczai's continuation or continuing role at the United Nations, even if the Taliban, correct me if I'm wrong here, James, even if the Taliban says he does not speak for us, he does not speak for the country, it's not actually down to them, is it? There is a body contained within the United Nations that decides this guy is the ambassador for that country, even if that country, in quotes, doesn't exist in the form that it existed when he was appointed to the position.
There is a procedure, and it's likely to be a contentious procedure. I think you need to see who the key players are on the Security Council and among the general membership of the United Nations, which ones start to recognise the Taliban, and then ultimately it will go to the General Assembly. But the first body that looks at it is something called the Credentials Committee of the General Assembly, and I think that's normally doesn't do very much work. It doesn't really need to do very much work. But on this occasion, with the next General Assembly starting next month, I think they're going to have to look at the credentials of Afghanistan and the current ambassador. But actually, at the same time, worth reminding you, there's a big row going on and dispute about the ambassador from Myanmar. So potentially, we could have two representations change.
Was it significant for you, James, when the Afghan ambassador was saying no time for the blame game? I mean, that does not chime at all with those people who are criticising the Biden administration right now.
No, and it doesn't, I don't think, chime with a lot of what I'm hearing from those that were part of the Ghani administration. Now, some of those are blaming the US, and some of them are blaming President Ghani himself, who clearly was despised by many in Afghanistan, including members of his own cabinet and some of his inner circle, as an ineffective leader at the end. It is interesting that the speech didn't really take a political tone. I think that's because this Afghan ambassador, now in a job that representing a government that doesn't exist, has only been in the job for nearly a month. He only presented his credentials to the Secretary-General taking up the job at the end of July, and his previous job was as a UN official. So I think it was a somewhat measured speech from him, not a political speech, just because of the background of the man.
We're currently waiting on the Norwegian delegation, the Norwegian ambassador wrapping up, because we're anticipating the US ambassador is next, James. As far as sort of international diplomatic circles are concerned, critics of the Biden administration are saying this was or is playing out in real time, day to day, week to week now, a colossal foreign policy blunder. It may damage, mightn't it, the US standing internationally as a force for good diplomatically, but will it damage the Biden administration, in your opinion, James? Because when one talks to American colleagues, American friends, or just engages with the debate in America, Americans are so weary of going to other people's wars and literally chucking in gazillions of US dollars to fund it, getting involved in nation building, and then pulling out anyway. Americans have had enough of this.
Well, certainly it will damage, I think, the US's credibility and power and prestige in the world concerning its allies and its adversaries. But I think you might be right on the point about Americans not caring about Afghanistan and not wanting to be in Afghanistan. But then again, remember the power of pictures. Remember those chaotic scenes that we've seen in recent hours out of Kabul airport. Those scenes are desperate for all of us. But they also, I suspect, show a humiliation of the US, the way it's had to leave, and that will play out on every American's TV screens in the coming hours. Let's see what the US have to say about this, because the US ambassador, Peter, is about to speak.
OK, James, we'll talk to you in a minute. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary General Guterres, Thank you for your sobering briefing and for your strong statement. Your role, along with your personal envoy, Jean Arnaud, and Special Representative Lyons and her team on the ground, is especially vital now. And as we enter an uncertain and crucial period that requires the international community to speak with a clear and unified voice. The United States deeply appreciates the continued efforts of UNAMA and other UN actors on the ground in Afghanistan that are continuing to provide life-saving assistance to Afghans in need. We also thank Norway and Estonia for calling this meeting and India for convening it given the events of the past 72 hours. And we welcome the participation of Afghanistan to this meeting. Over this past weekend, members of the international community joined together to state unequivocally that every Afghan should be able to live in safety, security, and dignity. We also called on all parties in Afghanistan to ensure safe departures and the protection of human life and property. Today, I want to reiterate, reemphasize, and reassert this call. Civilian populations, including journalists and non-combatants, must be protected. Attacks against civilians or civilian objects must stop, and the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Afghan citizens, especially women, girls, and members of minority groups, must be respected. We also call on all parties to prevent terrorism, and we must all ensure Afghanistan cannot ever again be a base for terrorism. We also call on the Taliban to permit humanitarian organizations to continue their vital work in Afghanistan. In addition to the ongoing violence, the Afghan people are suffering acutely from the effects of COVID-19 and drought. These urgent humanitarian needs must remain top of mind for all of us in the coming hours, days, and weeks and beyond. Humanitarian personnel and agencies must have safe, unhindered access to provide life-saving assistance to the increasing numbers of Afghans in need. We are deeply concerned that right now aid is not flowing to people in crisis. According to the World Food Program, more than 500 tons of aid are currently sitting at border crossings taken over by Taliban forces. These aid deliveries must resume immediately, and the World Food Program must have immediate and sustained safe passage to deliver this much-needed assistance. Finally and critically, all Afghan nationals and international citizens who wish to depart must be allowed to do so safely. President Biden has made clear that any action that put U.S. personnel or our mission at risk will be met with a swift and strong military response. The United States promises to be generous in resettling Afghans in our own country, and I'm heartened by the pledges we've seen from other nations to do the same. We need to all do more, and the time to step up is now. We urge Afghanistan's neighbors and others in the region and beyond to give refuge, to be it temporary or permanent, to Afghans attempting to flee. And together we must do everything we can to help Afghans who wish to leave and seek refuge. I will close where I began. The Afghan people deserve to live in safety, security, and dignity. We in the international community stand ready to assist them. Thank you very much.
Keynote speaker there at that special meeting of the United Nations, the US Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Minority groups must be respected, she said, talking about girls and women, people suffering anyway. She was making the point from COVID-19, coronavirus, and there's a bad drought in certain areas of Afghanistan. And now, because a lot of the borders have been sealed, aid is not getting to the people who need it, the people in crisis. James Bays is our diplomatic editor. Time to step up is now, she said. James, what does that mean?
I don't know what it means. It's really not clear what the US will do beyond what they're doing currently at Kabul airport, because they have no tools anymore. The US is virtually out of Afghanistan. The only operation they have is that ongoing operation at the airport. Clearly, there was a strong message, I think, to the Taliban about that ongoing operation, saying that any interference with them, any attack on them, would be met with a swift and strong military response. But beyond that, most of the speech, one of my colleagues said to me, was very, very safe. She didn't. There were no strong, particularly strong words, emotional words. She didn't describe the scenes that have concerned us all so greatly in the last 48 hours, particularly the chaos at Kabul airport, where the U.S. military are supposed to be in control. None of that. It was a very, very safe speech by the U.S. ambassador. No passion. Some would argue perhaps no compassion, given the scenes we've been seeing.
James, many thanks. James Bays, our diplomatic editor, wrapping up the events there at the United Nations in New York. That meeting called so that all the relevant delegates and ambassadors can talk about what's going on in Afghanistan today and yesterday. Today, we've seen those scenes of absolute chaos, dangerous chaos at the airport, as people were so keen to get out of the country, literally hanging on to the side of US military aircraft. Antonio Guterres saying we must respect human rights. Now is the time to stand as one.